Kimberley Wilde. Kimberley is a sociologist. She has worked across Western Australia's community sector and has volunteered with several grassroots human rights and environmental campaigns. So I looked at her online presence because she didn't specify which organisation she's worked with, so listen to this. She's been a project officer for Tenancy WA and for the Street Law Centre, and has worked for the WA network of alcohol and other drug dependencies, and now she's working for the Justice Reform Initiative. This is all extremely hard work, right? It's not the kind of work that people usually stick with for very long. It takes a very certain, particular kind of person with a lot of care and commitment to stick with this kind of work and do it, and I think we can all really admire that. The impacts of imprisonment have been woven into the tapestry of Kimberley's family and her life, and I think this influences her advocacy for the whole system reform, with the goal being to reduce incarceration and build safer, more inclusive communities. So thank you to Kimberley for her work, and thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you. My name is Kimberley. Before I begin, I also want to respectfully acknowledge that we're meeting on Wajak Noongar country, that it's Reconciliation Week this week, and we're speaking about a topic that disproportionately impacts Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So thanks for coming, thank you for your interest in public discourse, and thank you for your interest in this topic. It's one that's really important to me, obviously. Like Christian said, around Australia, 78% of people self-identify as knowing nothing about the prison system. I'm going to assume that most people in this room are in that 78%, and the rest of us might know sort of like a little bit to a lot about the prison system. So to start, I'll give an overview of the prison population in Australia in recent decades, and build a picture of who is in prison in Western Australia. In Australia. So because I'm a sociologist, I will talk about social determinants of incarceration. I'm not going to speak about victims of crime at this point, except to say that we really need to bust out of that binary of victim versus perpetrator, because that fails to recognise. Am I holding this wrong?
Make sure we don't point that toward there.
Okay, so that binary of victim versus perpetrator fails to recognise that most people in prison are victims of crime as well, and also fails to recognise that prison sort of tends to spectacularly fail, keep on turning that way, victims as well. I'm really happy to speak about that later tonight in the discussion though. So first, the number of people in prison. I'm going to talk about adults. Again, happy to talk about kids later, but right now I'm talking about adults. So in 1983, there was a daily average, is that better?
Yeah, that's much better.
Yeah, okay. So in 1983, there was a daily average of just under 10,000 people in prison in Australia. In 2023, that number was 41,929. So prison population growth has massively outstripped national population growth. So from 83 to 2023, the adult prison population grew by 319%, and in that same period, the whole national population of adults and children grew by about 71%. So the way we talk about numbers of people in prison usually is in incarceration rate, which is the number per 100,000 adults. The Australian imprisonment rate was 66 per 100 for 100,000 adults in 1985 and 206 in 2023. It's around double or more than double of OECD equivalent countries like Canada, France, Germany. The US is an outlier, but even the US, since reaching a high in 2008, has actually reversed their trend. Their incarceration rate is decreasing. It still eclipses ours, but it's decreasing in response to a bipartisan commitment to reduce the numbers of people who they send to prison. Conversely, in Australia, our imprisonment rate in recent years between 2003 and 2018 was the third fastest growing in the OECD, behind Turkey and Colombia. The current WA imprisonment rate, we do it better than the rest of the country, is 304. The Russian imprisonment rate is 300. So right now, WA men's prison estate is over capacity, it's over 100%, and that means overcrowded. Almost 2/3 of people in prison in WA have been there before, and more than a third of people have returned to prison within 2 years of being released. We'll talk about WA here. And about a third of people are on remand. So that means they haven't been convicted, they haven't been sentenced, they're awaiting trial, they were denied bail. You should definitely ask me about remand later. So who do we incarcerate in Australia? Spoiler alert, it's mostly marginalised and disadvantaged people. Poverty is a huge driver. Australian researchers have recently identified 8 key social determinants of incarceration. So these are in no sort of order of prevalence, except that the first one I think is the most important, is being Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. And this is not inherent. It's a result of colonisation, systemic racism, over-policing, marginalisation over generations. Aboriginal people are criminalised Australia-wide. The proportion of adult Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander adults in prison is 32%. In WA, it's nearly 43%. That's the highest First Nations incarceration rate in the country, and highest in the world, according to some, depending on which measures you're looking at. In WA, an Aboriginal adult is 18 times more likely than a non-Aboriginal adult to be sent to prison. Having been in foster care, so there's a huge overlap between kids in care and prison, and that's in the youth justice and adult prisons. The stats, the available data and the available stats are sort of incomplete and contradict one another, but we're looking at about more than half of kids in contact with the juvenile justice system for both community corrections and in detention, having also had child protection interventions. Again, really, really disproportionate representation of Aboriginal children in that group, which shouldn't have to tell you. Receiving a poor school education. So 66% of people entering prison in Australia in 2022 reported having an education level of Year 10 or below, and that's compared with 16% of the general population. And around 80% of people in Western Australian prisons have a literacy level either equivalent or below that of an 11-year-old child. Having contact with, early contact with police. So contact with police is criminogenic. When you have contact with police, you're more likely to have ongoing contact with police, and you're more likely to have contact with other tiers of the criminal legal system. The earlier that contact is with police, the more likely you are to be incarcerated. Having unsupported mental health and or cognitive disabilities. So half of people entering prison in Australia in 2022 reported a diagnosed mental health condition, including alcohol and other drug dependence. There's a study, landmark study that was done in Banksia Hill in 2018, and the Department of Justice will never let anything like that happen again. But 9 out of 10 children there were identified as having a severe neurocognitive disability, and about 3 in 10, a bit over 3 in 10, with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. Problematic alcohol and other drug use. So again, in 2022, 73% of people entering prison reported recent illicit drug use, so illicit drug use within the previous 12 months. Not all of that will be problematic, but that sort of indicates the high prevalence of alcohol and other drug use. Experiencing homelessness or housing instability. So about a third of people who are incarcerated experience homelessness in the 4 weeks before going to prison, and about half expect to be homeless on release. That is getting worse with the current housing availability and affordability crisis around Australia. And coming from or living in a disadvantaged location. So a lot of these social determinants, they intersect and they entrench each other, and so that's kind of how we end up with these disadvantaged locations that ultimately end up being over-policed and criminalised. So there's a systemic failure to address these social drivers of incarceration, and there's no sort of single, the prison system kind of becomes the drip tray that people fall into when other systems fail. And it's a really expensive drip tray. There was more than $6 billion spent on prisons around Australia last year, including capital costs, and it was $8.65 million in WA. And there's not one kind of single thing that we can just go, there you go, that'll fix the incarceration rate. There's, most of the solutions lie outside of the criminal justice system. They're in those systems like health, housing, education, mental health, with health as well, child protection. There's a compelling evidence base. There's multiple proven, cost-effective, long-term solutions to address the problem of over-incarceration, and it's at all points of contact with the criminal legal system, from that primary prevention, that's those other systems, early intervention, policing, diversion, alternative court systems. There's so many opportunities to, during prison, in prison programs, pre and post release support like Mervyn and Lorraine offer, and Aboriginal programs must be prioritised because it's impacting First Nations people more. So it's really important for community well-being and fiscally responsible government that we look at reducing the incarceration rate in Australia, and really look forward to having a chat about that a bit later.